The Road Home, a contemporary exploration of the Buddhist path, written by Nichtern, read by Naomi Kirst-Schultz. This is the introduction, part 2. It turns out that my father's small talk question to the Tibetan Lama was actually immensely profound. In thinking of home, we have to move beyond considering home as a physical address. We have to start asking what home feels like. My main teacher and guru, Sakyong Mipam Rinpoche, emphasizes that it is never enough to have good ideas. We need to familiarize ourselves with how experiences make us feel on a deep and personal level. It is beneath the frameworks of ideas, in the very taste and texture of experience, that true insight is born. We use language to describe and communicate feelings, but the feelings described by language are actually the most important thing to befriend. To be a sentient being literally means that we feel first, and that we think and act later on the basis of these feelings. So how does it feel to feel at home? How do we act when we feel like we belong? When I feel at home, or when someone else truly makes me feel at home, I feel comfortable, supported, safe, and relaxed, like I don't need anything. At those times, my past ceases to be a neon marquee of regrets, and my future is no longer an unending to-do list bullet-pointed by unrealistic expectations. Feeling at home is the feeling that I can just be myself. It would be wonderful if there was a more psychologically complex description of this feeling, with which to impress some academic journal. I'd love to concoct some 7-syllable yogic word that sounds mystical, ancient, brilliant. Just be yourself, Asana, but in fact, the simplicity of being ourselves is actually the ideal outcome of traveling the path of awakening. When I feel at home, I can also begin to feel truly available to others, because their presence no longer comprises my identity or threatens my safety. When other people no longer seem like threats, I open my eyes and take greater interest in the society we share, this earth on which we are all natives and locals. Is it ever really possible to feel completely at home all the time, to be free of anxiety and struggle? What's the actual difference, anyway, between someone who lives fully in the center of her awareness and a confused person? Are awakened beings born that way, neurologically or spiritually different from the rest of us? Is that Tibetan Lama made of a different substance a more enlightened bloodline? In this era of self-aggression and idealistic celebrity, there is always a tendency to otherize positive qualities, a tendency that is unfortunately amplified by the fact that the Buddhist teachings originate in a foreign cultural context. You could say, from the perspective of the tradition of meditation, that there is actually very little that separates an enlightened being from a zombie commuter. Both have to deal with the pains and the pleasures of life. There's no way to bypass them. The only difference is that the confused person is constantly lost in commute, grasping for home among the slippery and unstable objects along the road. The enlightened person is already at home, living in the center of her awareness. The enlightened person has made the space of her own being into a sustainable home, with immeasurable square footage. The awakened person has plenty of mental space to accommodate and deal skillfully with the entire range of life's emotional experiences, making room for fear, lust, anger, uncertainty, jealousy, and all the other emotions that come with being human. We could ask this very same question about confusion and wisdom on a larger scale. What's the difference between a confused society and an enlightened society? A confused society, a deeply endangered society, is a group of people all lost in nightmarish commute. The systems, institutions, and culture of such a society discourage people from feeling the trust and belonging that come with being at home in your world. A confused society is a society of isolation and exclusion, one in which fear becomes profitable and self-reflection becomes a threat to established bureaucracies. An enlightened society is one where the culture encourages time for self-awareness, belonging, and connection. An enlightened society would actually foster cultural and social relationships to help commuters find their way home. It's that simple, in theory. But quote-unquote simple should never ever be confused with quote-unquote easy. Our personal journey is rarely easy, and our global journey is even less so. Because everything is interdependent, we have to work on both of these levels at once. Trying to change society without deeply understanding our heart-mind won't work. Your own road home can never be separated from society's journey. We need a unifying theory and language that allow us to link the lessons of our personal journey with the situation facing our world. The important question then, a question laced with a gorgeous irony, is, how do we get home from here? Or, maybe more appropriate, how do we get here from here? Not at home. The crisis of materialism. What word best describes the epidemic arising from a life of constant commute? What happens when we have to clutch fearfully at the objects of experience in an attempt to find security? What happens to a whole society of people who systemically feel ashamed? Feel ashamed about being with themselves and are taught that their best option is to become comfortably numb to their experience. What psychological damage do we enact on ourselves? How do we torment each other, and what environmental havoc do we unleash on the world when we repeatedly avoid working with our minds? From the Shambhala standpoint, the word to describe this illness is materialism. When we call somebody materialistic, we usually mean that he has superficial or petty values, that he has mistaken beliefs about what really matters in life. For me, a Madonna song comes to mind, but what the tradition means by materialism is something subtler, more metaphysical, and more universal. Materialism is the belief that consciousness is unimportant, and the mind is reducible to the brain, and therefore that the path to happiness involves precise chemical manipulation. Materialists don't believe in the importance of the mind itself and instead reduce life to the pursuit of pleasure. As such, they have grown deeply insecure about their relationship to their own awareness. Every bad choice we make in life and every destructive and greedy system at work on this planet comes from this insecurity, from the actions of human beings who don't feel at home. To understand the theory of materialism, we must have a basic understanding of the subject-object nature of human experience, and how the Awakist tradition leads us to bravely encounter our own heart-mind. We are each a subject, one who exists and perceives objects of experience within the space of our lived awareness. When a subject can't feel at home within his own subjectivity, he has no choice but to attempt to solidify home by grasping for safety, quote-unquote, out there. This process of objectification is the basic fuel of our nightmarish commute through samsara, a road trip spent oscillating between chasing after and then rejecting a range of experiences, trying to arrange all the right moments in all the perfect ways, and doing anything we can to avoid discomfort. A basic fact of reality, however, is that all experiences we encounter are fundamentally unstable. In other words, impermanent. The attempt to create a real and lasting home out of any collection of impermanent objects is going to eventually produce recurrent stress and deep anxiety instead of lasting comfort and safety. Whether it's a physical object like a remodeled kitchen or a mental object like a feeling of inner bliss, both are bound to change. Even though they might make us feel safe for a while, neither object is reliable as a true home. Rather than taking the impermanence of all experiences as a message to focus more attention on his own heart-mind, the materialist takes impermanence as a kind of beat-the-clock challenge to collect as many meaningful experiences as he can before time inevitably runs out. On the coarsest level, this leads to a culture of consumerism as the materialist in each of us constantly seeks new objects to replenish our collection of worthwhile experiences. For example, the materialist remodels a kitchen and only focuses on the cabinets and the fixtures, without any awareness of how his mind is responding to the experience of inhabiting the kitchen, how he lives in his awareness as he moves through the space. Eventually, the shine wears off the refrigerator and he decides he needs a brand new kitchen all over again just to feel temporarily at ease once again. With all of his mental energy tied up in pursuing the next object, he usually avoids any meaningful awareness of himself as a subject, the very me he was trying to make happy in the first place. In a scary, impermanent world, the materialist lives as far away from his awareness as he can. Such a life is spent in object management mode, suppressing pain and chasing pleasure, prostrated before the flight or fight part of the nervous system, obsessed with short-term fixes, defending constantly against short-term threats. When you don't want to look at your own subjective experience, the best thing to do is to live by what you can touch most viscerally, which is the reliable chemistry of pleasure and pain. Materialism, the human illness that arises from the objectification of home, is not something to be judged. Materialism is simply an immature response to reality, one that has existed throughout human history, and that has been repeatedly fortified by culture and philosophy, a response that we all fall victim to in one way or another until we complete the path of learning how our heart-mind really works. Let's not judge Wall Street or anyone else too harshly for making the same mistake of objectification that beings have been making since the dawn of, beings. At the same time, non-judgment certainly doesn't mean passivity. If we understood materialism's mistaken cause, we wouldn't continue empowering greed as a social norm. Our materialistic impulse is totally understandable, the way a child's temper tantrum is totally understandable. We can't do anything about our materialism unless we develop some real empathy toward it, along with a sense of humor. When a child is throwing a tantrum, we try our best to be skillful and compassionate and appreciate where the child is and how his fears are valid. That doesn't mean we don't hope that the child eventually matures and learns to regulate his emotions more effectively. The same goes for an adult's immature attempts to control objects, to solidify the fluid phenomena of his life into some kind of lasting home. We each start where we are, of course, but we try to head to a more mature place. The awakest path is all about slowly learning to regulate our materialistic tantrums in the face of reality's rules, to recognize with a playful attitude that we have a childish relationship to reality is where this path begins. The path is never about discarding emotions. It's about cultivating more emotional maturity, which means having more awareness of how our emotions operate, learning that they contain deep intelligence, but that they also present us with destructive obstacles. To call materialism immature is not a value judgment, but simply a recognition that it makes us want to convert objects into what objects cannot become, solid and permanent. At the same time, we can't pretend that the outer world has no effect on our consciousness. Objects matter. We will feel differently on a day when it is warm and sunny than we feel on a cold, rainy day. Living in poverty versus living in privilege has a huge effect on how people experience their lives and their minds. A person recovering from intense trauma is in a different situation from someone who hasn't experienced difficulties to the same degree. To become a student of Buddhism does not mean forsaking the outer environment and how it affects us. Awakeism means becoming curious students of the relationship between inner and outer circumstances and between subject and object. The ancient philosophy of materialism. Materialism was an actual philosophical system in India that paralleled the spread of the Buddhist meditation tradition. What the early materialists believed was sophisticated and at least somewhat scientific. They thought that all reality was material, i.e., matter, and that the universe was just a huge sequence of random chemical and physical arrangements arising from 4 basic elements, or chemical building blocks. For them, what meditators call consciousness, what the Tibetan Lama called awareness, what I'm calling the heart-mind, was all just a perceptual myth, a romantic idea of philosophers and contemplatives. In today's terms, a pure scientific materialist would say, I don't see any mind, I only see a brain and a nervous system that can be chemically and biologically regulated and manipulated. It's actually hard to argue with such a person on his own terms, because the only way that the heart-mind can be experienced is personally and subjectively. That is why meditation is such a crucial tool. For ancient materialists, human existence was little more than an accident, a throw of cosmic dice at an intergalactic craps table, a fleeting, random occurrence. There could be no path to awakening, the materialists thought, because a path to awakening requires the belief that the most important asset in human life is our consciousness itself. The materialists, by definition, didn't believe that consciousness actually existed, so they didn't believe that there was any need to work with our habitual tendencies or conditioning. Nor did they believe in any ethical basis for choosing what to do and what to avoid. Why would you even bother to argue about ethics? Why does it matter how you treat people when only matter matters? The materialists made living pleasurably the highest spiritual pursuit of life, and the spiritual paths they advocated were the ones that evoked a veritable feast of blissful feelings. This philosophy has repeated itself in many forms throughout human history. At their height, the materialists were sort of like emotional foodies, sucking on sensation, drizzling their days with moments of ecstasy, garnishing life with comforts. At their most profound, the materialists were scientific naturalists, producing great poetry born from an Epicurean interest in the richness of the present moment. At their most superficial, they were addicts and hedonists, sipping on the champagne of the day like ancient Jay Gatsbys or Don Drapers, laughing ironically, undermining the logic of anyone who dared to lecture them about ethics, morality, or the powerful momentum of habit, known as karma. The hedonists obsessed over the haute couture of their era, investing their entire lives in the pursuit of pleasure, shrugging off the idea that we have a responsibility to help others unless it was to help others share pleasure. Let's face it, the materialist embedded in each of us knows 2 important things, 2 truths you can't really argue with. 1, life is short, and 2, pleasure feels a hell of a lot better than pain. 3 types of materialism: physical, intellectual, and emotional. The founder of the Shambhala tradition, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, didn't just discuss this materialistic tendency to objectify reality in relation to physical possessions. He saw the physical objectification of our world, its reduction to an input of dead matter for consumption, as an enormous problem and the root of environmental devastation. Still, he taught that materialism can cause us to fixate on even subtler objects. He realized that we make the mistake of chasing after home not just on the level of physical comfort, but on deeper psychological levels as well. On the level of intellect, we fixate on ideologies and shut out opposing views, vilifying those who disagree with our perspective. In an even deeper way, we fixate on our emotions. And, at the deepest level of materialism, we objectify what it means to be a spiritually mature person. Physical or sensory materialism. Of course, the most obvious external way that we chase after safety is by looking for instant gratification through our senses. The sense perceptions can create pleasure and comfort and temporarily ease the anxiety of not feeling relaxed in our own being. But sense pleasures can't ever solve the fundamental issues created by avoiding your own mind. Intellectual or ideological materialism. Ideas and ideologies serve an important purpose. They communicate experience and create new ways to understand our journey. Being able to think clearly and consider ideas is very important. Sometimes people falsely believe that a good spiritual path should be anti-intellectual. Nothing could be further from the truth. If we aren't able to think clearly, then how are we ever going to find our way through the vast and complex world that we inhabit? Thoughtful ideologies can help us to describe the world. Ideas are the source code of great technology, art, and discourse. But ideas are unable to do one thing: become a true home for our experience. The map of Barcelona is never the experience of Barcelona. A menu is never a replacement for a meal. Ideologies, by their nature, are fixed descriptions of a world that is constantly in motion. If we try to create a lasting home from our ideologies, we will always fail, ignoring the moments when reality shifts its terrain and where our ideas need to shift as well. Emotional, spiritual, or psychological materialism. In a seminal spiritual work, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche discussed the idea of turning the highest pursuit of spirituality or awakening into another means to objectify reality. From the standpoint of materialism, the purpose of spirituality or psychology or any practice related to the mind for that matter is to use spiritual practices to reliably produce a certain emotion, like joy or ecstasy. In their subtlest forms, emotions are actually objects too, objects that arise within the space of our awareness. Emotions are not where we live. Like any other object, they are just regular visitors in the home of our heart-mind. When we try to decorate our experience with certain quote-unquote spiritual emotions like happiness, peace, or bliss, and throw out other emotions like sadness and anger, we invalidate a huge amount of what actually happens to us. A spiritual materialist fixates on feeling like a spiritual person and tries to make a permanent home out of the heightened emotional states that he attributes to his spiritual practice. In that state of innermost hedonism, we only pursue human relationships that make us feel peaceful or ecstatic. We might fall in love, but only so long as the intoxication lasts. We might work with a mentor, a therapist, or guru, but only if they tell us what we want to hear. We might practice meditation or yoga, but not if it means confronting difficult feelings like anger or jealousy. If we leave a practice session feeling less than perfect, we think the practice is not working for us. We might buy incense and statues, but only until the odor bores us and the statue's sheen wears off. We turn human examples of wisdom into robotic representations of peace and happiness, rendering them safe to reinforce the boundaries of our narrow comfort zone. The problem with spiritual materialism is that if our heart-mind were truly an inviting home, we wouldn't be rejecting the emotions that are often deemed less spiritual, less peak, like sadness, anger, disappointment, loneliness, and remorse. We wouldn't turn other humans into superheroes or villains based on our latest spiritual elation or disappointment. If we were at home in our own mind, we wouldn't have to spend life chasing after only a small range of prized feelings to arrange like trophies on a shrine, rejecting all other emotions as lesser, unworthy of our experience. This is a subtle and difficult point, but the path of awakening is not about objectifying certain emotions as worthy and others as unworthy of visiting our home. We cannot find comfort by chasing after mind states that feel, quote-unquote, divine. If we do this, we will spend most of our life rejecting what we are actually experiencing, pretending that we are on some holy path while really we are on an evasive journey away from our own humanity. Our blissful smile will be knit together by a deep, underlying sense of self-loathing. If we don't work compassionately with whatever comes, we will be forced to constantly defend against the invasion of unwanted emotions. Without the experience of all emotions, our journey will cease to be a human one. The road home is a human journey through feelings, not around them. Meditation is a practice of accommodating feelings, not a way to sanitize them. This understanding should be the starting point for anyone who attempts to meditate. In his very first teaching on the Four Noble Truths, when he discussed the causes of our dissatisfaction, the Buddha implicitly linked emotional materialism to the source of all our confusion. One major cause of dissatisfaction, as he described it, was an attempt to annihilate the feelings we experience in the present moment. Attempting to limit and quarantine the range of emotions only serves to compound our pain. Likewise, when we react to feelings blindly, we also avoid facing them. Suppressing and acting out against feelings are the markers of our innermost materialism. In both cases, we are trying to defend against the intensity of actually living. Trying to defend against feeling what we are feeling is the subtlest form of mental violence and leads to a lifelong path of internal warfare, a boxing match where reality and fantasy bludgeon each other with no clear winner. In this tradition, this kind of inner emotional violence is considered to be the root of all the systemic greed, hatred, and avoidance we experience as a society. Because there is no way to defend against feeling our feelings, there is also no way to make our peak, blissful, sacred, divine emotions into a permanent home. Nor will we find any salvation in idealizing the relationships, romantic partners, creative muses, spiritual gurus, etc., that we think will deliver only blissful emotions, ecstatic insights, and heightened experiences. If we are going to conquer materialism, we have to make the heart-mind into a place in which the full range of human emotions can feel at home. Beginning the journey. This book follows a fairly traditional structure with 4 parts representing 4 main bodies of teachings. While most of the teachings, especially in the first 3 sections, are derived from an ancient Indo-Tibetan tradition, My interpretation of each of these bodies of insights comes from the perspective of looking at the heart-mind as our true home, examining how that insight affects our relationships and our understanding of our collective identity as a human society. In the book's first section, we look at the journey of self-awareness. This is traditionally called Hinayana in the early texts of the Indo-Tibetan tradition, or literally the small vehicle, because the scope of practice is limited to one's own subjective experience. Here, we look at the mechanisms of our mind as the basis for coming home to ourselves. First, we'll investigate some simple insights and lingering myths regarding the increasingly popular practice of meditation in Chapter 1. Then, we will look into the teachings on karma, where we'll explore the habitual conditioning and stuck patterns of behavior that keep us caught up in the commuter's mentality. Chapter 2. Then, we will discuss how the practice of self-awareness permeates every aspect of daily life through the practice of ethics. Chapter 3. And finally, we will explore how the journey of self-awareness can shift our idea of the self and transform our view of human nature together. Chapter 4. In the book's second section, we look at the journey of relationships, traditionally called Mahayana, or literally the expansive vehicle, as the scope of practice becomes broader and more interpersonal. We broaden the focus to include relationships not only because living in awareness reveals that we are accountable to others, but also because we come to recognize that our very sense of who we are as individuals is co-created in relationship to others. This co-creation of our sense of self begins very early with our parents and continues with everyone else we meet. First, we explore the basic interdependence of self and others to see how compassion meditation practices can help us to understand other people better. Chapter 5. Then we discuss Buddhist teachings on human communication, extending the insights of mindfulness into the realm of effective listening and speaking. Chapter 6. Then we look into the often misunderstood concept of emptiness, seeing that if we misapply this potentially liberating idea, we might end up using our spiritual practice to bypass the difficult relationships of life, rather than to deal with them. Chapter 7. We go on to the practical implications of trying to live a compassionate life by considering a Buddhist approach to boundaries in relationships. Chapter 8. This section ends with an exploration of various types of student-teacher relationships that may help guide us along the path. Chapter 9. In the book's third section, we look at the idea of sacredness, traditionally the third body of teachings in the Indo-Tibetan tradition called Vajrayana, or literally the indestructible vehicle. In this body of teachings, also known as Buddhist Tantra, every aspect of life and practice, as well as every emotion, is said to have the potential to reveal that our mind is a profound and sacred home. First, we examine the ways that we unnecessarily divide our secular experience from our spiritual path, and explore the view that these secular and spiritual truths can be completely integrated into one enterprise in which spiritual practice and worldly life support rather than fight against each other. Chapter 10. Then we look at the practice of visualization to see how we can transform our imagination into a space where we view ourselves and the world as sacred. Chapter 11. Finally, we look at the Shambhala principles of Windhorse and Drala to see how the subject-object relationship can be seen as the basis for a sacred relationship to emotions as well as ecology, and can prepare us for full engagement with the larger world. Chapter 12. And in the book's final section, we look at our shared path as a community and society. We look at various ideas for evolving the teachings of Buddhism beyond the individual and the interpersonal into a cultural, social, and political space. First, we look at how seeing the reality of interdependence causes us to develop our understanding of the journey beyond the traditional three-part framework above into an exploration of how the personal, interpersonal, and collective aspects of practice can all be worked with simultaneously in Chapter 13. And then we discuss how the institutions of a confused society mirror the confused habitual patterns that arise in an individual, and how those institutions might transform into supportive systems for enlightened society, Chapter 14. Then we look at the role of culture, art, and creativity as practices of transformation that affect the environment of our collective experience in Chapter 15. Finally, the book concludes with some advice for making the Buddhist teachings your own in order to truly come home in your own way in Chapter 16. I will see you on the road. This has been The Road Home, a contemporary exploration of the Buddhist path, written by Ethan Nichtern, read by Sen Naomi Kirst-Schultz. Introduction Part 2. Since the publishing of this book, there has been a report called Buddhist Project Sunshine that revealed allegations against the current lineage holder at the time, Sakyong Nipam Rinpoche. Sakyong and Rinpoche are both honorifics that I do not believe this person deserves, and so in further mentions I will not be using them and will refer to him only as Mipam. Until next time.